Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a question that's been keeping a lot of people up at night.
Mm-hmm.
Is the U.S. economy about to go full Zimbabwe and
Wow.
fall into hyperinflation?
Right.
You've sent us a whole pile of articles,
Yeah.
analyses, and even some historical deep dives to help unpack this. And I have to say, just flipping through it all has got me a little nervous.
It's understandable
Yeah.
to be concerned.
Thank you.
Hyperinflation is this almost mythical economic monster.
Right.
And the idea of prices spiraling out of control is definitely scary.
Yeah.
But we're going to break it all down,
Right.
look at the facts, and see if the U.S. is really on the brink of economic collapse, or if we're all just getting worked up over nothing.
Okay, first things first. Let's
Yeah.
define exactly what we're talking about. I mean, we all know prices go up. That's just normal inflation, right?
Mm-hmm.
But where does regular inflation cross the line into hyperinflation?
Think of it this way. With regular inflation, maybe the price of a gallon of milk goes up a few cents every year.
Right.
Annoying, but
Yeah.
manageable.
Yeah.
Hyperinflation is more like if that gallon of milk doubled in price every week.
Wow.
And it's not just milk, it's everything.
Okay.
Hyperinflation is when prices rise so fast, they essentially become meaningless.
Wow. So it's not just about prices being high.
Yeah.
It's about how fast they're increasing.
Exactly.
Now, looking at the material you sent,
Right.
the example of Zimbabwe in 2008 really sticks out.
Yeah.
The inflation rate there hit almost 80 billion%.
It's a crazy
Now,
example.
it's billion with a B.
Billion with a B.
People's savings became worthless practically overnight.
Zimbabwe is a textbook example of what can happen when a government prints too much money
Right.
without any corresponding economic growth.
Okay.
Imagine suddenly flooding a small town with millions of dollars.
Yeah.
Everyone has tons of cash, but there's still the same number of houses,
Right.
cars,
Mhm.
and groceries. Suddenly, everyone's bidding against each other for the same limited stuff, and prices skyrocket.
Right.
It's like basic economics on overdrive.
So too much money chasing too few goods?
Yeah.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, I have to admit, writing about Zimbabwe,
Yeah.
it made me think about some of the headlines we've been seeing about the U.S. deficit and rising inflation here.
Sure.
I mean, are we heading down the same path?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's why we're here on this deep dive.
Right.
While those concerns are understandable, most economists don't think the U.S. is headed for a Zimbabwe-style meltdown.
Okay.
In fact, there are some key differences that make a hyperinflationary scenario here very unlikely.
Okay, let's hear it. What are those key differences?
Right.
I know one economist, L. Burke filed, uses the term pressure relief valves when talking about the U.S. economy.
Yeah.
What does he mean by that?
Files argues that economies like the U.S.,
Okay.
which are open to global trade, have ways to release inflationary pressure.
Okay.
Think of it like a steam valve on a pressure cooker.
Okay.
If things get too hot, excess pressure can escape.
Got it.
In the case of the U.S., if prices rise too much here,
Right.
consumers can buy goods from other countries where they're cheaper.
Okay.
This helps prevent prices from spiraling out of control in the way they did in Zimbabwe,
Mhm.
which was much more isolated.
So basically, our connections to the global market act as a kind of safety net.
Yeah,
That's an interesting way to look at it.
it is.
Yeah.
And it's not just about trade.
Okay.
Economists like Asher Rogovi and Jim Pendergast
Mm-hmm.
also emphasize that the U.S. Federal Reserve,
Right.
our central bank,
Mm-hmm.
has a lot more tools and credibility than the central bank in Zimbabwe did back in 2008.
Okay.
The Fed can raise interest rates,
Mm-hmm.
adjust the money supply,
Mm-hmm.
and generally try to steer the economy in a way that prevents things from getting too out of control.
Right. So it's not just about printing money. It's about managing the money supply and taking steps to keep inflation in check.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that brings us to another important point. Most economists believe that the current inflation we're seeing in the U.S. is partly due to some unique circumstances caused by the pandemic.
Okay.
Things like supply chain disruptions and shifts in consumer spending patterns.
Okay.
They argue that this is different from the kind of runaway money printing that fueled hyperinflation in Zimbabwe.
So it's a more complex picture than just saying
Right.
the government is printing too much money and we're all doomed.
Right.
But even if we're not headed for a full-blown hyperinflationary crisis, you've got to admit there's still a lot of anxiety out there about rising prices and what it means for the future.
For sure.
It's definitely true that even if we're not facing a Zimbabwe-level meltdown, rising prices are still hitting people's wallets hard.
Yeah.
I mean, my grocery bill alone makes me want to cry these days.
That's a sentiment a lot of people share. And it gets to the heart of why inflation is so politically charged.
Yeah.
Even moderate persistent inflation can have a real impact on people's lives, especially if wages don't keep up.
Yeah, it's like you're running on a treadmill just to stay in the same place.
Hmm.
You work hard, but your money buys less and less over time.
Exactly. And that erosion of purchasing power has distributional consequences.
Right.
Some groups, like borrowers, can actually benefit from inflation because the real value of their debt decreases.
Okay.
But savers, especially those on fixed incomes,
Right.
can see their life savings dwindle in value.
So inflation creates winners and losers,
Yeah.
and it's often the people who are already struggling who get hit the hardest.
That's a major concern, especially in a time of rising inequality.
Yeah.
If wages aren't keeping pace with productivity, and then inflation eats away at people's purchasing power even further,
Right.
it widens the gap between the haves and the have-nots.
Which, as we've seen throughout history, can lead to social unrest and political instability.
It
With a
can.
vicious cycle.
It is. And that's why it's so important to consider the broader social and political context when we're talking about inflation.
Okay.
It's not just about numbers. It's about people's lives and livelihoods.
Okay, so we've talked about how inflation can erode purchasing power and
Yeah.
exacerbate inequality.
Yeah.
But are there other ways,
Mm-hmm.
maybe less obvious ways,
Yeah.
that inflation can sneakily impact our lives?
One area that often gets overlooked is the impact on long-term planning and decision-making.
Okay.
When inflation is high and unpredictable, it throws a wrench into any kind of financial planning.
Right.
Imagine trying to save for retirement or a down payment on a house
Yeah.
when you have no idea what your money will be worth in 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, it makes me think of that old saying,
Yeah.
trying to build a house on shifting sand.
Right?
It's hard to plan for the future when the ground is constantly moving beneath you.
Exactly. And that uncertainty can have a ripple effect throughout the economy. It can discourage investment, stifle innovation, and make businesses hesitant to hire new workers.
So it's not just about the direct impact on prices,
Yeah.
but also about these indirect effects on behavior and decision-making that
Right.
can have far-reaching consequences.
Precisely. Inflation can create a kind of psychological trap
Right.
where everyone gets so focused on short-term survival
Yeah.
that they stop thinking about the long term.
And that can have serious implications for economic growth and overall well-being.
It can. And it brings us to another fascinating aspect of this deep dive.
Okay.
The idea that inflation can be a tool,
Mhm.
even a weapon,
Okay.
in the hands of those in power.
Okay. That's a bit of a mind bender.
Yeah.
You're saying inflation isn't always just an accident,
Right.
that it can be strategically deployed.
Throughout history, we've seen governments use inflation to achieve certain goals.
Okay.
Sometimes it's about eroding the value of debt.
Right.
Other times it's about reducing the real value of wages
Okay.
without having to explicitly cut them.
So it's like a hidden tax,
Mm-hmm.
a way to redistribute wealth without people necessarily realizing what's happening.
That's one way to look at it.
It-
And those who have the power to shape economic policy
Right.
often have the means to protect themselves from the negative consequences of inflation.
So while everyday people are struggling to keep up with rising prices, those at the top can insulate themselves from the pain.
Yeah,
It's a sobering thought.
it is. And it reminds us that economics is never truly neutral.
Right.
It's always embedded in power relations and social structures and political choices.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, moving beyond the simple question of hyperinflation to explore the broader impacts of inflation on our lives.
Right.
From eroding purchasing power to impacting long-term planning and even being used as a tool of power.
Mm.
It seems like inflation is this silent force that shapes our world in more ways than we realize.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
It's a force that can be difficult to grasp, but has real tangible effects on our lives and the choices we make.
Before we move on to part 3, where we'll dive into some potential solutions and strategies for navigating an inflationary world,
Yeah.
I want to leave our listener with one final question to chew on.
Okay.
We've talked about the economic and even the political impacts of inflation.
Right.
But what about the psychological effects?
Yeah.
How does living in a world where prices are constantly rising,
Mm-hmm.
even if it's not hyperinflation, shape our behavior, our attitudes, our sense of trust in the system? That feeling of constantly falling behind, no matter how hard you try, it has to take a toll. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Living in an inflationary environment can create a pervasive sense of anxiety,
Right.
even if it's not full-blown hyperinflation.
Yeah.
You start questioning your financial decisions, wondering if you'll ever be able to afford the things you need, let alone the things you want.
And that kind of anxiety can breed distrust,
Oh, for sure.
not just in the economic system, but in the institutions and leaders responsible for managing it.
Exactly. It erodes that sense of shared purpose and faith in the system.
Yeah.
That's crucial for a healthy society.
Right.
People start looking out for themselves, hoarding resources, and losing faith in the idea of a collective good.
So it's not just an economic problem, it's a social and political problem, too.
It is.
Okay, so we've talked about the dangers, the anxieties, the potential for things to unravel.
Yeah.
But what can we actually do about it? What are the tools,
Yeah.
the strategies for navigating this inflationary landscape?
Well, the solutions are as complex and multifaceted as the problem itself.
Right.
Let's start with the most familiar tool, the one wielded by the Federal Reserve. Monetary policy.
Right. The Fed's been raising interest rates lately, trying to
Yeah.
cool things down. But is that always the right approach?
Well,
And who ends up paying the price when they do that?
it's a delicate balancing act.
Right.
Raising interest rates can help slow inflation by making it more expensive to borrow money, which in theory reduces demand and puts downward pressure on prices.
Okay.
But it can also slow economic growth, make it harder for businesses to invest and hire,
Right.
and even lead to job losses.
It's like using chemotherapy to treat a cold. Sometimes the cure can be worse than the disease.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah.
And it highlights the distributional consequences of these policies.
Right.
Often it's the people who are already struggling, those living paycheck to paycheck,
Yeah.
those with low-wage jobs who feel the pain of economic slowdown most acutely.
So it's not just about whether the Fed should intervene. It's about how they intervene and who benefits and who bears the cost of those actions.
And that's why a lot of economists are arguing that we need to think beyond the traditional monetary policy playbook
Yeah.
and consider more targeted approaches.
Okay, let's talk about some of those alternative solutions. You've sent me some articles about things like antitrust enforcement,
Yeah.
excess profits, taxes, and even price controls. Let's break those down.
Antitrust enforcement focuses on breaking up monopolies and promoting competition.
Okay.
The theory is that when more companies are competing for customers, prices will naturally stay lower. But antitrust lawsuits can take years to play out,
Yeah.
and they don't always address the root causes of inflation,
Right.
especially when those causes are global or tied to supply chain issues.
So it's a long-term solution, not a quick fix.
Right?
What about excess profits taxes?
Well, during inflationary periods, some companies,
Oh, okay.
especially those with a lot of market power,
Right.
can actually reap huge profits because they have the ability to raise prices faster than their costs increase.
It's like they're profiting off the very crisis that's hurting everyone else.
That's the argument behind excess profits taxes.
Okay.
The idea is to capture some of those windfall profits and use them to fund programs that help those who are being squeezed by inflation or invest in initiatives that address the underlying causes. It's a way to redistribute some of the gains and try to level the playing field a bit.
Makes sense. But what about the most controversial tool in the toolbox, price controls?
Right.
I mean, the government actually setting limits on what businesses can charge.
Price controls can be effective in the short term,
Okay.
especially in emergency situations. Think about rent control in cities with severe housing shortages.
Right.
But they can also distort markets, create shortages, and lead to black markets if they're not carefully designed and implemented.
So it's a high risk, high reward kind of strategy.
Exactly. And it highlights the complexity of this issue.
Yeah.
There's no single solution, no magic bullet that will fix everything.
Right.
It's about using all the tools at our disposal, understanding the trade-offs, and trying to find the right balance.
So what can our listener take away from all of this? I mean, it's clear that inflation is a complex beast with no easy answers.
Yeah.
How do we move forward without just throwing our hands up in despair?
I think the key is to shift from feeling powerless to feeling empowered.
Right.
And the first step is education.
Okay.
Understanding how inflation works, what causes it, and how it impacts different groups. That knowledge allows us to engage in these conversations, advocate for policies that promote fairness and economic stability, and make informed choices in our own lives.
So it's about being informed,
Yeah,
being engaged, and taking control where we can.
exactly.
What are some concrete steps our listener can take to navigate this inflationary landscape?
Well, on a personal level, it's about making sure your income is keeping pace with inflation.
Okay.
That might mean negotiating a raise, asking for a cost of living adjustment, or even looking for a new job with better pay.
Right.
It's also about being smart with your savings and investments. Consider options that offer some protection against inflation, like Treasury inflation-protected securities,
Mm.
TPS, or diversifying your portfolio with assets that tend to perform well during inflationary periods,
Okay.
like commodities or real estate.
So it's about being strategic,
Yeah,
doing your research, and making sure your money is working for you, not against you.
exactly.
Yeah.
And don't forget the power of community and collective action.
Right.
Support policies that promote affordable housing access to healthcare and a strong social safety net. These are the things that help create a more resilient society, one that's better equipped to weather the inevitable economic storms.
Great advice. So, to wrap up this deep dive, I think the main takeaway is that inflation, even if it's not hyperinflation, is a force we need to understand, engage with, and ultimately try to shape in a way that benefits everyone, not
Absolutely.
just those at the top.
I think that's a great point.
Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. And to our listener, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep pushing for a better world.